Hello everybody. Last video then was focusing on poverty. So we were looking at absolute and relative poverty. And you should all now be comfortable with absolute poverty is where people's earnings are deemed too low to afford basic essential needs. So internationally agreed level is $1.90 per day at PPP. Relative poverty is where your income is low compared to other people within your society. So we could look at 50 or 60% median income. So if you earn less than 50 or 60% what the middle income person does in your economy, then you are deemed to be in relative poverty. What I now want to do is to focus on inequality. So we're now looking at that gap in incomes between the richest and poorest people within our society. Now it's worth, first of all, just differentiating between income and wealth. Income is a flow of money. So for most people, their incomes will be from jobs. So incomes or wages from going to work. But there can also be interest on savings in the bank. There could be rental incomes on properties that you own. There could be dividends on shares. Wealth, well, by the way, incomes also could be government support, so it could be welfare such as unemployment benefits, it could be disability allowances or old age pensions. Wealth is a stock of money, so this could be savings in the bank, it could be money that you have tied up in the value of property that you own, it could be shares that you own, it could be businesses that you own or government bonds. And for most people, wealth will generate additional incomes. So you do tend to find that these two go hand in hand. The more incomes you earn, the more wealth you're then able to generate from that. So people with higher earnings can buy more shares, they can buy more property, they can buy more businesses, they can invest into more pension schemes, and these things will allow them to earn additional income streams in the future. What we're going to be looking at is how we go about measuring inequality. Now, we measure inequality, and this can be either income or wealth, by looking at a Lorenz curve diagram. We're then going to be thinking about how we can use this diagram to understand what we mean by a Gini coefficient. So Lorenz curves and Gini coefficients can be used to measure inequality in an economy. Now, what I want you to do first of all is to ignore this blue line. I want you to focus instead on this black line here. Now, what we've done, we've ranked the population from the poorest to the richest person in the economy. So we've lined everyone up from poorest to richest person. What we've then done on this axis here, we've looked at the percentage of the incomes. So we're now looking at how the incomes are distributed amongst the citizens of an economy. Now this black line here, this 45-degree line, would show me what we call the line of full equality. Now think about what this means. What this line shows is that the poorest 25% of the people earn 25% of the income of the country. The bottom 50% of the population earn 50% of the income of the country. The bottom 75% will earn 75% of the income of the country. Now what this line therefore shows is what we call full equality. If we operate on that line, it means that incomes are shared equally amongst people within your society. And that would mean that you have no relative poverty in your country. It could of course mean that you've got absolute poverty, but it would mean that everyone in your country is in absolute poverty. So here we have no winners and losers, everyone is equally well off as everyone else. Now that doesn't exist. What we have is inequality, and we can measure how unequal a society is by looking at the blue line, which is the Lorenz curve. Now look what this shows. This shows the poorest 25% of the population based on the way I've drawn this diagram, earn, let's say, about 7% of the income of the country. The poorest 50% of the people earn, based on the way I've drawn this line, roughly about 20% of the income of the country. Now think about what that means. If the poorest 50% earn only 20% of the income of the country, it must mean the remaining 50% must earn the remaining 80%. So this would show that the richer people are earning a significant proportion of the country's income or wealth. The poorest 75%, based on the way I've drawn this line, they have between them roughly, let's say, 45% of the income of the country. Now what that would mean is the richest 25% would earn the remaining, 55-60% of the income of the country. Now what we would expect to see is Lorenz curves to change over time. Now if it was to shift inwards, such as this would be a reduction in inequality. And look at why. If it moves inwards, the poorest 25% of the country now earn a bigger proportion of the income of the country. That gap between the rich and the poor has fallen. It would also show that the richest 25% now earn a smaller proportion of the income of the country. So if it moves inwards, we've got falling inequality levels. If we move it outwards, it would mean that inequality is increasing in the country. And think about why. Based on that new line that I've drawn, the poorest 25% now earn, 1 or 2% of the income of the country. So we can plot this over time to measure how inequality is changing in a society. Now here's a few statistics about the UK when it comes to Lorenz curves. And some of this data, you might say is fine, you might say it's disgusting. I think that often comes down to a value judgment, your own personal opinion. But in the UK, the top 1% of people, so people close to this 100% here, they earn on average £150,000 per person per year. The bottom 1%, they earn only £8,430 per person per year. So you've got a huge gap between the poorest and the richest people in our society. The UK is one of the world's most unequal rich countries. So if you were looking at places like Scandinavia, you would find that inequality is far lower than what it is in somewhere like Britain. The poorest 10% of people, so these people down here, between them they have got 1% of the country's income. The richest 10%, so these guys here, they earn 31% of the country's income. So you've got this phenomenal gap between the rich and the poor people in society. And obviously the assumption would be that the bigger the inequality levels, the more number of people will be in absolute and relative poverty. Now, one thing that we do in Britain which reduces the risk of absolute poverty is that we have welfare support. So where lots of poor people's incomes are propped up by government benefits. This could be disability allowances, unemployment benefits, it could be tax credits that top up low people's earnings. But what it means is that the bottom 40% of people in our country receive almost 50% on average of their income from welfare support. So we've got a big proportion of our society who rely on government support to prop up their income levels. So guys, the logic would be, when you think about it, if the government were to increase welfare support, you would assume inequality would fall, the Lorenz curve would move inwards, closer to the full equality line. If we were to reduce welfare support, it would mean that the Lorenz curve would shift outwards, and that would mean that we've got a growth in poverty and inequality in our economy. Now what we can then do to make this even more easier to sort of analyse across countries and across time, we can calculate what we call a Gini coefficient. So we use this diagram to give every single economy a score for their inequality. Now what I'll do I'm going to be thinking about the line of full equality, and I just want to focus on this Lorenz curve. So ignore the ones in blue, focus on the black equality and then the red, the inequality. Just remember, if that red line moved outwards, we've got more inequality. If it moves inwards, we've got less inequality. Now what we would do, we would measure this area A, which is this full sort of semicircle here. We would also measure this area B, so the gap between the actual Lorenz curve and the axes in effect. Now what we would then do, we would use this formula A divided by A plus B. Now the good news is, everyone, you are not expected to calculate Gini coefficients from Lorenz curves, but you are expected to know what the Gini coefficient score shows about a country. Now if we were to input data into this formula, the closer to 0 that we get, we've got more equality. So a smaller gap between rich and poor people. The closer to 1 we are, the more inequality that we have. So countries are scored from 0 to 1, and it's using the Lorenz curve to calculate this score. So if we were looking at a country like Norway, you tend to find that the gap between rich and poor people in Norway is far lower than countries such as the UK. So their calculation would be 0.26. So what you might argue is this first line here, this first blue line, could be Norway. So their Lorenz curve will sit closer to the line of full equality than what other countries will do. The red one could be like the UK, 0.38 or 0.35 or there or thereabouts. So we're a more unequal society than Norway. Brazil could be this blue line here. Their score is 0.53. So they've got a bigger gap between rich and poor people in their economy than both Norway and the UK. So guys, inequality is measured by using Lorenz curves, and then we use those to calculate Gini coefficients. Thank you very much.